I'm so happy to be here with Krisha as well, who's been coming on the scene only over the last year, but doing amazing networking, reaching out beyond India. So it's really wonderful to be here with these wonderful women. And I'm coming from a very, very big picture, a lot of experience that started in an indigenous culture, which was Ladakh, which is the westernmost part of Tibet. It's a part of Tibet that belongs politically to India and is still quite unknown, which is remarkable because so many people have, had a great interest in Tibet. But this part of Western Tibet, which is almost as big as England, that had about 100 villages and a small town, that had been evolving according to their own values, their own worldview for centuries. The Dalai Lama was the spiritual head, but it was an independent kingdom for many years. And because India was very worried that this part of Tibet should not get run over by China, all the borders were guarded and no one was allowed to go there. So when it was thrown open in the mid-70s, it was a remarkable opportunity to get to know an ancient indigenous culture that was still operating according to its own values, its own worldview, its own science, if you like, that went back for centuries. And what I found was I was living in Paris. I was quite international. I had spent time with the Zapatista Indians in Mexico. I had seen indigenous peoples and been very interested, but I hadn't lived with them. I hadn't got to know them. I had lived throughout Europe. I had learned to speak about 6, 7 languages, and I was a linguist living in Paris at that time. I'm Swedish, English, also a bit German, but had also lived in America, France, quite a few places. So I was very globalized. And I had quite a Western worldview at that time. I thought I really understood a lot. But coming into this place, I discovered the happiest, most amazingly joyous people I had ever encountered. And my take is later on that the reason they were so radiantly joyful was that they hadn't been colonized. They hadn't been pushed the way a lot of the Native American communities had been in South America or even in Mexico. They had to withdraw a bit, and they weren't able to be so incredibly open and joyful. They weren't free in that way. So I've come to realize that colonialism and slavery, imposed huge damage on people around the world. And anyway, from this experience, I ended up giving up my job in Paris as a linguist. I ended up staying. I had come out as part of a film team thinking I'd be there for 6 weeks to pick up a bit of the language, and I had learned enough to be in love with these people and amazed by them. So I give up my work in Paris, I stay, and I basically stayed virtually for a lifetime, giving up career. Later on, I met my husband in London. He gave up his career as a lawyer, and we worked for years with these people, but also in Bhutan, in Nepal, and connected to indigenous people and traditional cultures around the world. So later on, I wrote a book called Ancient Futures, and that book was essentially arguing that there is so much that we need to take with us into the future from indigenous cultures, which of course medicine is all about. I'd say the difference is that I'm from 40 years of living for a long part of the year out with the people and seeing how the Western system became what I called a knife cutting through relationships, just separating people from each other, from the earth, and from themselves. Seeing how that system operated has made me a bit of an expert on understanding the global economic system and how it works in that way worldwide. And I've come to understand why we have an epidemic of depression around the world, and particularly among young people. So that can be a bit hard for us to look at, but I I want to tell you that I'm extremely hopeful about the future. I am absolutely certain that we're going to end up prevailing. What we're all about here will prevail, will win. What we could do, however, is avoid more major crises of, like COVID and others, if we could wake up more to understanding that global economic system. So I'm passionately motivated by trying to encourage a deeper knowledge, both of what we need to clearly describe as a patriarchal Western system, which arose out of a few Western men deciding to expand across the world, imposing slavery and enclosures in Europe, enclosures, driving people away from the land. So the outset of this economy has always been to drive us away from nature. And that means very practically that today that system still continues to destroy farming as a livelihood, to destroy smaller towns, to destroy everything we care about, deeper relationships. I also want to say that as I talk about the importance of localizing, I want you all to be aware that most people who experience local rural communities will say, oh, I don't want to be there, because whether in India or in Sweden, where my main home, most of those rural communities have been marginalized, left behind, made to feel stupid and backward. Their knowledge, particularly as farmers, for instance, has been not only undervalued, but totally ignored. So don't hesitate to embrace localization or localism because of your experience of local communities that have been left behind, because they do not show you what I could show you if you're interested in our work, which is the new local. And the new local consists actually of a lot of people like us here who have often had international experience and who often, through that, develop a clarity about the dominant consumer monoculture not being to our liking, and people who search for more community and deeper connection to nature. And when you look around the world, as I have done, and speaking many languages, working with closely with about a dozen cultures, South Korea, Japan, Italy, anyway, around the world, what you'll see is that there's a huge cultural turning that shows that people who have tasted the emptiness, the deadliness of an urban consumer culture develop a longing for nature, a longing for community, because that dominant path, as I said, has been like a knife just cutting through our interdependent relationships with one another, our interdependent relationships with the plants, with the animals, with the water, with the earthworms that are the real economy and that are the source of all the cultural diversity we have. Everything we call an indigenous culture was a culture deeply embedded in that living natural world. And that meant that the diversity of languages, the diversity even of races we have, were because of the deep adaptation to Mother Gaia. What has happened is that through modernity, which started with these enclosures driving people off the land forcefully, dumping them in a Dickensian London, which in the modern worldview, there's a new, anyway, there is a lot of awakening now about the need for us to look at modernity in this more holistic way. And what modernity did was to tell us that the baseline was Dickensian London. Look at the mess, look at the illness, look at the gap between rich and poor and how horrible it was. Progress has given you your little house in the suburbs. It's given you heating. It's giving you, cooling. And look at how well off you are. We're so much cleaner. We're so much healthier. We all used to die age 40. That is all rubbish. That's all propaganda for a worldview that has romanticized techno-economic progress. Right now, we're on a threshold, a major threshold, because we have this huge cultural turning where people are showing either that they get destroyed by the modern urban consumer culture and the terrible pressure, the time pressures that mean that everyone has to run faster to put food on the table, a roof over their head. We really need to recognize that our governments, from left and right, are dishing out the same economic formula which started with this destruction of rural cultures, pushing us all into a more urban, ever more competitive race. Now, when we wake up to that and we wake up to the truth that there is this huge cultural turning, we will feel a lot more empowered than we do right now as we look at the predictions of crises that are real. We'll be a lot less confused by what's becoming now a situation where we're polarized. So whether it's the vaccine and COVID, whether it's climate change, whether it's racism as the root problem, all of these issues are pseudo issues polarizing us in this dramatic way. And as you know, many families were torn apart by some people happily having vaccines, others not wanting it. Around climate change, what's happening is that people suspect that the dominant narrative is not honest. And that's leading to some people saying, well, there is no climate change. But actually, if you had followed, as I've done, starting in the 90s, I was part of a group that I helped to take the initiative to called the Forum on Globalization. Vandana Shiva was part of that. I hope many of you know her. And I've worked with her since the early 80s. And in this group on globalization, we were able to get funding to meet about 40 people from all around the world to study the impact of trade treaties and to see that governments were signing on to these treaties that gave global corporations and banks the right to come into their economy and have absolutely no rules, no restrictions. They even set up these free trade zones where they could totally ignore any environmental or social protection measure. Now, governments are still signing these treaties that have clauses called ISDS, Investment State Dispute Settlement, where governments are saying in black and white, we will not do anything that threatens your potential profit. If we do, you can take us to court. Governments are being taken to court by corporations, kangaroo courts, and for instance, from Sweden, a nuclear power company sued Germany after they decided to phase out nuclear power after Fukushima. So a Swedish nuclear power company gets billions of dollars from the German government. Now, this truth about trade treaties, I really hope you'll be willing to spread the word about that, because it's like the last, most outrageous step in a history of global traders dominating our economies, our cultures. And please keep in mind that these corporations control the social media, they control the mainstream media, they control more and more what's happening in science. Science has not been for quite a while an objective search for truth, an honest weighing up of options. So for instance, in medical trials, they do supposedly really honest trials where one group gets a placebo, the other group will get the real medicine as they're trying out to see side effects. And they do a first run through, and when people get side effects, they're thrown out of the study. That's called science today. And it's happening in agriculture, it's happening in medicine, it's happening in engineering, it's happening, virtually every avenue of knowledge has been colonized. Now, please don't let me depress you with that, because the good news about that is that in that mainstream, whether it's in academia or in media or in the social media, you don't get to hear about the wonderful things that are happening all around the world that testify to human goodwill, human longing for love, for connection, that deep, deep need that is a universal human need of every child that's born onto this planet. To be loved, to feel loved, to be seen and heard. What I discovered in indigenous culture was that the structures meant that every mother had about 10 caretakers for every child. That meant that every child ended up truly valued as an individual, seen, heard, deeply, deeply seen as who they were, and accepted exactly as they were. Honestly, I can't exaggerate enough the importance of that. The scarcity of care now, where the average mother is feeling overwhelmed and guilty and is meant to fulfill the role of what previously was at least half a dozen people, uncles, siblings, neighbors. And it don't just come with the trite phrase, oh, well, it takes a village to raise a child. There's so much we can do if we really understand the importance of this. And it doesn't mean that we all have to live in villages. It doesn't mean that we have to go back to being exactly like the indigenous people. There is so much that we can carry with us if we do that more consciously of the structures in the traditional cultures, not just the values, not just the rituals and the prayers, but the actual practical structures. And what that comes back to is more local interdependence, and why I have found that one of the most strategic and one of the most rewarding things has been for me to help to start local food economies around the world, helping to start new farmers markets, also in England, starting in the early 90s, in America, all around the world. And these local food initiatives rebuild structures that essentially emulate the indigenous. We are seeing how it reduces the gap between conservative farmers and green, left-leaning consumers. We're seeing amazing healing of people and land. The shorter distances between the farm and the table stimulate diversified production above ground, not just in the soil. Watch out for regenerative agriculture. Corporations are pushing that term to essentially cover up and try to do away with what is a worldwide local food movement, a worldwide local food movement, which is bringing with it huge benefits. So I've probably covered a lot of territory, and it probably has been all over the place, but that is what this big picture is that I have to share. And I want to conclude by saying that I, as an activist, what I'm encouraging is compassionate, loving, big picture activism. I urge all of you to see activism as sharing this bigger, more honest picture about what's going on this planet, and to do so with compassion, to do so with forgiveness, not to judge yourself or others if you have a foot in the corporate world. Don't assume that everyone working in a corporation or every scientist who subscribes to shallow science is consciously being deceitful. Please be aware that we've been trained into a very narrow perspective to suit a far too big global economic system. I want you to know about Small is Beautiful, Schumacher College. If you haven't heard my friend Satish Kumar, please listen to what he has to say and learn about Schumacher College. There's a lot out there that you may not have heard of that is deeply empowering and eye-opening and really positive. I hope I have stressed the positive enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena. Thank you for the many conversations we've had. And thank you, Ruby and the Advaya team, but also the Medicine Festival team for creating these safe containers and safe spaces. I say to so many people who've now become friends and family here that I can't wait to see more spaces and gatherings like this back home in India. I know many here, including Ruby and the Advaya family, have been inspired by the knowledge systems and Indic knowledge that comes from the land I was born in Mumbai, in India. And the sad thing, which really broke my heart a few years ago, is when I realized that I had been robbed of the opportunity to learn about my own roots. I can't speak my own language as fluently as I speak English. I went to one of what was considered the best schools in Mumbai. My parents moved to the city to give me and my siblings the best opportunity that they thought they could, which they believed was in the city, in an English medium school, to save up enough money to send us abroad to America and to the UK to get the best education that they thought possible. My reality represents the reality of so many young Indians who are now part of this growing middle class, which everyone is celebrating because they have more access to financial wealth, they have more disposable income, they're becoming part of bigger consumer markets and producer markets. But what brought me and drew me to Helena, to Satish Kumar, to Dr. Vandana Shiva, was the truth that they were speaking of, which I could sense in my bones was the cause of a lot of anxiety, depression, a sense of purposelessness amongst those who are considered very privileged and living in big cities like Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, but also in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. Once I got to know Helena, I attended the Local Futures Conference last year in Bristol. I heard so many inspiring people speak, and the big question in my mind was, why was this not part of our education growing up in India? I went to UC Berkeley in California, where I studied political economy, followed by a master's in social policy and development at the LSE. But I never came across voices like the voices being showcased here today. And that's my question, Helena, as you described to me so beautifully. What is the reality of the dominant globalist or globalization paradigm that is disconnecting us from our roots and is sending us everywhere, further away from our homes, to make us feel valued, worthy, intelligent, and capable of contributing to society?
Well, basically, as I said before, unfortunately, the big money has colonized virtually every avenue of knowledge. So starting with schooling, we need to look critically and honestly at that. It was actually a training to suit the industrial elites that emerged after enclosures and slavery were established. So after that, there was a need for people who were willing to follow the clock, who were willing to work with the precision that now steam engines and later on fossil fuel powered technologies demanded. So all of society had to speed up to suit the needs of technology. So from schooling onwards and going back quite a long time, we've been trained to suit the needs of what was already a global economy and based on technology. And today, we've got to be really aware that AI, in the service of the financial casino and the corporate sort of empire, is going to speed things up even more. And we're going to be running faster and faster and faster, and all the time being told that these technologies are saving us time. But in this pursuit and with what's going on, partly we don't even have time to search out alternatives. And in the meanwhile, the mainstream media of every kind, including social media, and as I say, in mainstream academia, history has been rewritten. In academia, for instance, an archaeologist from Eastern Europe, someone named Maria Gimbutas. How many of you have heard of Maria Gimbutas? Oh, okay, a few of you. So Maria Gimbutas was an Eastern European archaeologist, and she had found evidence of feminine, goddess-centered, matriarchal peaceful cultures in Europe. And she was laughed at by academia. Now, only in the last few years, DNA studies have proven her right. So archaeologists have apologized to her posthumously. But that rewriting of history that ignored those foundations and that have actually put what was a white patriarchal culture, Western culture, on steroids, now fueled just as much by women, women of color, people in Africa, China, India, elites in all those cultures are signing on to that mainstream agenda with a vehement energy, because they've been told that if they were to stay true to something more feminine, something more real, something more organic, something different from the mainstream Hollywood version of consumer culture, there'll be nobody. So there's a fear of being left behind, which is why Tony Blair, the other day, comes onto the mainstream media to say, England is a mess, we got all this poverty, we're broken. AI is going to save us. AI. And with AI, we'll be ahead. We won't let those, the subtexts, we won't let those Chinese or Indians get ahead of us. So this race pursued by leadership in India and China and America and virtually every nation state is extremely dangerous, and it prevents us from hearing the story of how the majority show very clearly they want something else. And please remember that one of the ways they're showing it is epidemics of depression, anxiety, and particularly among young people. So even in Ladakh, the happiest people I had ever encountered, suicide was something like maybe one in a generation. Now it's at least one a month, and mainly young people. So we need to be clear about how the dominant system is continuing to be very destructive, but also to be clear that whether in Mumbai for people like Krisha, or whether you hear, we don't get to hear the full story that shows that people want something else and are actually, when they can, making the steps, this huge turning towards nature. It includes birth doulas, death doulas. It's bringing things back to community, to the embodied, experiential, connected. Our embodied spirituality, which is now arising, is the earth-based spirituality. And you see it everywhere, the coming back to that basic connection. So please, open your eyes to both sides and help to share both sides. Big picture activism.
One of the things we've spoken a lot about is what's been so difficult for people to come on board with. Why has the movement not grown? And what's kept so many beautiful movements fragmented? And I think it's been a challenge for people to understand that what we're fighting is not really individuals, but it's ideologies and systems that are designed centered around certain ideologies. And if we want to radically shift to a very different future, the task in front of us is shifting culture and shifting a value system which allows us to place value or place worth on things that are intangible, immeasurable, more felt and more intuitive. Helena, can you just share more a little bit about how do we fight, or not fight, I think that word is probably
it's
wrong.
All right, you can say fight.
Fight. How do we fight an ideological war, and how do we do that with beauty and love and showing something that's not so far-fetched? I think sometimes people think you're asking them to go very far, but it can be a much more integrated or close to home solution, which is what I'm interested in, empowering people in big cities like Mumbai, where they're very much not trapped, but they have ties, they have obligations, they have family. How can they be a part of localization without feeling like they need to leave everything behind and move somewhere far away?
I just first want to say how thrilled I am to be working with such a beautiful, intelligent, articulate colleague. Krisha is now an ambassador for our organization, and I'm just so, so happy to be working with you. It's just such a delight. And it is this thing I just want to say also that I'm finding that this piece that's missing in this great cultural turning is the techno-economic piece. So this movement towards localization, which is towards nature, towards community, is led by women worldwide. So these local food initiatives, it's often the farmer's wife who will help to start them. It's very often mothers who are concerned about the quality of the food in the farmer's market. So it's definitely, it's a movement led by women who still own their feminine, who respect their feminine. And I just want to, by the way, here, side thing, but what I saw was that the dominant economy marginalizes the two most important things we do as human beings: how we rear our children and how we rear our food. And both the mothering and even the parenting and the food growing has been marginalized and turned into shadow work, underpaid, undervalued. So this whole movement is about reversing that. But how do we do it practically? We need to change the I to a we. We need to start by not thinking, oh, what can I do? And very often people will say to me, oh, well, I'm sorry, I bought something at the supermarket. It's not all local. And I say, oh, please, please don't do that. Don't believe that you as an individual are going to be able, through your personal shopping habits, change the world. This has been indoctrinated in us by corporate interest that managed to pervert a movement that when I joined it in the 70s was very clear that we needed policy change, meaning we need collective change. If we want to get away from being so dependent on the mobile phone, do we think that we're going to be able to tell our teenage children, no, you can't use it, meaning that they'll be excluded. They'll feel like they don't have community. It's virtually impossible as an individual to do this. We need to come together. So one of the ways to come together around this terrible curse of the influence of the mobile phone on children is to start the discussion and to join groups. Like one woman who spoke at our summit, she started a group called Tech Off, which is trying to build momentum. So at least you're not choosing between isolating your child or letting them use the phone, but you're actually doing it collectively. So the initiatives that I love are things where people realize that even in the city, if they form a core group by deciding with one or two other people that they want to come together. So we like to leave people with 5 words. And the first one is reconnect. The second one is rethink. The third is resist as well as renew. Don't hesitate your voice of resistance to the dominant trends. Don't shy away from that and think, oh, well, we know the problem, let's just talk about solution. And the final word is rejoice. Remember to every day bathe yourself in the knowledge of how much is still beautiful and functioning in this world. Today, when Zach was talking, I'm trying to remember Zach Bush, but I wanted to point out that, every child that's born is this beautiful, radiant being. We're not all these gray slugs before we become dragonflies. I think that analogy doesn't allow us to remember just how beautiful people also are. And particularly, as I say, every child that's born. So this is, I don't want to only leave, with a word of criticism or difference with Zach, because I love him and a lot in common. But I guess I'm coming from a more feminine perspective. Anyway, to come back to this question of, how do you do it in the city? If you sort of remember, don't go at this alone, but find, 1 or 2 like-minded people. Could be at work, could be friends, could be, sometimes people will show one of our films and say, see after that film showing how many people would be interested in discussing this further and looking at what we can do collectively to start moving as a we, not as an I, towards that healthier, localized way. And remember that a synonym with localized is that localized futures are essentially re-indigenized futures. They're more feminine futures, including men who have regained respect for their feminine, who have found their feminine, which plant medicines have contributed to, which is why I think this festival has so much energy and respect for the feminine. But what does that look like practically? So once we start raising the status of food production and childcare, there are so many things you can do collectively to start moving things. And it may not sound as significant as I could talk for this hour and a half just about local food economies, why they are the most strategic, why they're the most vibrant, why they're the most effective local economy initiatives. But I'm alone in calling it local economy because many of the women who start this, they're doing it for the love of healthy food. They're doing it because they see that the quality of the food is so destructive, or they're doing it because they see their farm is becoming bankrupt, trying to compete in the dominant global system. So around localization, there is not a lot, but a fair amount that you have to rethink to understand what genuinely localized circular economies would look like. And you've got to be aware that Nestle and Coca-Cola are talking circular, are talking regenerative, even boasting of local. HSBC is the world's local bank. So you have to be clear about the distinction. But anyway, if you come together in the city, then there are also ways that you would more consciously share the childcare. I know of examples in childcare where the intensity of the sort of nuclear family, which is so unhealthy, the nuclear family is just far too small. If I could just say very clearly, we would never have evolved if we couldn't have functioned in nuclear families. We were never self-reliant. We evolved because we were community reliant. We had a bigger family group to care for the children and to care for the animals and the earth. And we had much smaller economic units. So we had bigger family units, smaller economic. And as we go into the future, we need to keep that in mind. And the nuclear family is a complete consequence of economic and technological pressures towards urbanization and much more. But so what you can do in the city, if you become aware of these things, you can create your own DIY vision quest. You could create your own mini medicine festival, because what we also discover as we look more and more at what's satisfying for people, it's human scale circle groups. It is, and that's emerging intuitively and naturally, the circle of a smaller human scale group deeply sharing from the depth of being vulnerable, of being imperfect. The nuclear family linked to the dominant economy has made us believe that unless we're perfect outside the walls of our nuclear family, which is the only place we really know each other, then we won't be loved. So one of the key things that's happening, and we can much more consciously do, is sit in those circles. And we don't need to be paying, I don't know, I mean, therapists generally are not trained for community healing. And community healing is probably the most important lesson from indigenous culture. Community healing is what happens in Alcoholics Anonymous. I haven't taken part in any of these, but I'm seeing young people healed from sex addiction, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, through essentially AA-style groups. And it's because you're healing as a community and you don't have that sense of aloneness. Remember hearing about Zach, about the aloneness. So my recipe for the aloneness is, yes, to recognize it and then to be willing to share it, to heal in deep connection. And the deep connection will only happen if we're feeling seen, loved, and heard with our faults and flaws. I hope that's a bit helpful.
What you shared, Helena, hits so close to home. Hearing you speak about what you saw in Ladakh, it reminds me so much of what the stories my own mother told me when I was growing up. So both my mother and my husband's mother, respectively, have 9 siblings. They came from families of 9. And within just a single generation, it's reduced. We're now families of 5 and now families of 4. And very quickly, we've seen nuclear families becoming the norm. Moving to big cities has contributed so much to the sense of aloneness that women everywhere feel, but definitely I can speak for India. And tying that to what you shared earlier about not demonizing each other or ourselves for the burden or the burnout that we feel. I think one of the things that's been most challenging for people in urban environments who are now living in nuclear families is a sense of, it's your fault, you're choosing this life. And I think that's very disempowering, and being able to hold the system accountable or to look at how the system has pushed us to be this way, it allows people to heal from having to shoulder the responsibility. I think I love that the theme of this festival this year is to carry peace, because this week itself has seen so much division being stoked on every issue possible. In India right now, there's a massive dialogue and a lot of anger happening surrounding a rape incident and about masculinity and all of the challenges. And every issue in the last few weeks has reached its boiling point. And here we are in this beautiful container. I think my call or my ask to you, Helena, is how do we encourage each other to not fight each other, but to find the middle ground, to engage in more dialogue, reflection, contemplation, and discussion, especially with those on the other side of the fence, because that's the only way we come to some sort of agreement for peace. And in terms of peace and diplomacy, is there anything you can share with us?
Well, again, it needs a much longer explanation, but actually understanding the big global system that, is often described as this patriarchal Western system, understanding how it operates today is extremely helpful for reducing the self-blame and for blaming the people in power. Once we understand how this system arose, once we understand what we're taught at school, once we understand what's been happening in science, once we understand how the training in the bureaucracy now, it's, among other things, people in our local councils are trained to police us. If we want to build a new room on our house, or even inside the house, build some steps or something, they come to measure and say, no, it's got to be 2 inches lower, and it's going to cost you X number of $1,000 to do it this way. So for me, studying the global economy, where all the time the rules for Amazon and Nestle and Coca-Cola have been totally removed. Freedom, you can do what you like, and in fact, you can sue our governments if they try to protect the environment or protect jobs. It's so insane. And then our taxes used to punish us and to inhibit the easy things we could do to develop more ecological housing, to provide not only plenty of housing, but much, much healthier food production. Remember, the local food needs more people on the land. And with more people on the land, diversified small-scale farms can produce vastly more food per acre of land. And not only because of the diversity, the end result is that the farmer feels much safer, doesn't have to be so fearful and dump, pesticides, because if there is a wind or a drought or too much rain, everything won't be destroyed. So the diversification on the land is part of the local economy's security. So this doesn't sound like an answer to your question, but the answer is that understanding from the root up this dominant system and focusing on that, I see the potential for a huge coming together. I've always been talking to taxi drivers, whether I've been in New York City or out in the country, in England recently. And recently in England, I had a driver actually in Somerset, not quite so far from here. And he was explaining how he'd had this chauffeur service in Reading, and he'd had about 10 cars, and he was doing quite well. And then Uber came in and destroyed his business. And yet, for the whole journey, when I tried to talk more to him about what was going on in England, he was blaming immigrants. And I said to him, but wait a minute, it's not the immigrants that destroyed your business, it was the global corporations. So I see everywhere that people are in agreement. It doesn't make sense that our governments, they don't know enough about the regulations, that they know that these big businesses are generally not paying tax. Almost everywhere you go, people would agree, no, we don't want global businesses to pay no taxes and to have no regulations, while everybody else is squeezed with heavy taxes and heavy regulations, many of which become extremely destructive at the local level. Now, what I'm saying here is a little bit more complex, because we do need government to regulate these global corporations and to start taxing them. And that could happen if we're able to build up the global movement we're trying to, so that at the table would be governments with civic society at the table, beginning to regulate global business. But at the same time, and right now, we could be lobbying governments to decentralize in a meaningful way to support local economies. It's beginning to happen at the local level. Mayors and local councils around the world are responding a little bit to the realities on the ground and being responsive to the demand to support local economies. But it's a little bit technical, but I think that it's all about us being better informed, and you absolutely don't need to study economics. Whatever you do, if you want to understand the economy, don't study economics. It's brainwashing, and it does not look honestly at what's happening. For me, it's very frustrating that I work with some very influential people who are willing to question things in their own field. But when I want them to help us question what's going on in the global economy, they'll say, Helena, I'm not an economist. And here I am, and I will tell you, I feel I understand this economy better than virtually any economist I've ever met. I've met Nobel Prize-winning economists like Joseph Stiglitz, some, well-intentioned. But he believes that we need technology to create jobs. This is part of the brainwashing. Almost anyone would understand technology replaces human labor. We need women. We need open-hearted, open-minded people who will look at this economic system honestly and to share the madness of what's going on, because it is truly mad. And now we're being told that AI is also going to save us time, it's going to improve healthcare, and it's going to support this casino economy. So I hope many of you will be willing to look at this and just look at basic principles, basic values, and really learn from indigenous culture about the economy.
I think we can open it up for questions now. And maybe, Helena, you'd like to speak about next year at the end, or now?
Maybe I'll just say next year that Krisha and I are planning a conference in Ladakh, which is West Tibet, but a part of Tibet that belongs to India. So we're planning an international conference there. I hope you'll look at our website, localfutures.org. And also at the end of August, we have a one-day course at Schumacher College in Devon, and also an evening event. It's called Feminine Futures, and 6 women from around the world are joining me: an indigenous scientist, a neuroscientist, a psychiatrist, and a food system specialist, and Camila Moreno, who was supposed to be here today, who's a close ally, who has been at all the COPs and seen how it's the corporations setting an agenda that is so counterproductive. So, yeah, so I hope you'll look at our website. And I also have some books that I'll be signing at the Resurgence tent in about half an hour after this finishes. If you're interested, I have the book Ancient Futures. I have a book about localization called Local is Our Future. And I have a book we wrote about agriculture, a very small little book that we're selling cheaply. We wrote it originally in the 80s, making the case for local food economies. Yeah, I think that's, thank you.
Hiya, thank you. My name is Carolina. I work with the movement to decentralize power in many different ways. I'm just curious about what networks and movements you guys are connected to in the UK. So I've heard a lot about the agriculture, I guess, like food systems, but do you work with community organizers and community economy builders, this kind of thing?
Yeah, we did help actually to start the Land Workers Alliance originally. Like, if you know about the Land Workers Alliance, and we've collaborated a bit with ORSC. And also, well, we used to collaborate with the New Economics Foundation. We were part of setting up the Wellbeing Alliance, but actually we just find they're not willing to look at the corporate system clearly. And I just so believe that we need to do it honestly, without demonizing, without blame. We don't have to blame any particular companies, any particular people, but look honestly at what that is driving. And we're finding the donut economy too. I know Kate Rayworth, but really not willing to talk about that. And so we're working more with an international alliance that we have created, including Charles Eisenstein, Bayo Komalafe, Anish Jain. I don't know if you know some of these people. We also used to work with Friends of the Earth, with many organizations that were, 30, 40 years ago, more on the same side. But I'm finding this unwillingness to look at the corporate global system. It's the piece that's missing. It's what could actually unite us. And it can be done without, as I say, demonizing particular company. It can be done while you work in a corporation. It's not that you have to be pure. None of us are pure. When we pay our taxes, we're supporting this system. It's not about you being pure and not using a mobile phone or not, working for a corporation before we discuss how we want to move away from this corporate rule and, dependence.
I'm really interested in, you mentioned Maria Simbutas. Yeah. I'm fascinated. All my life as a woman, I've felt undermined and unequal and just not equal. And I haven't done enough research myself, but I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about this idea that we do come from an ancient origin of profound sacred respect for women, and anything you can say about what happened and how can we quietly just reclaim this?
Yeah, well, I think, what happened is that around the world you will see that there were civilizations, including the Roman, including Genghis Khan, and so on, that expanded beyond their cultural boundaries to conquer others. But nothing compares with what happened from Europe with this expansion which led to the global economy. It was preceded by the rise in Christianity, where women were burned at the stake and where Christian missionaries also supported this trading expansion. But the role of trade, global trade, and the global economy in giving power to global traders that then had slavery, on one side and the enclosures in the West that then led to this sort of enslaved populations on both sides. So till today, this rich country, poor country dialogue is completely counterproductive. It's dividing the world and making Westerners feel that they're guilty, right now the race discussion is very counterproductive. It's making every white person feel that they must be inherently racist. White men are all demonized, and it's with the help of algorithms. So understanding the bigger picture and the deep feminine and what happened historically is what can really heal us, racially, male, female, rich country, poor country. There's a universal story where every human being today is dependent on two systems. One is this unbelievably big global techno-economic system that is pushing monoculture, biological and human, a consumer urban monoculture worldwide. And it's hyper-masculine. It's a teenage boy values, speed, war. It's based on fear and warmongering. And everyone on this planet is dependent on the real economy, the living soil, the living water. And it doesn't even get acknowledged as being an economy in this system where we're told that people who live off the land have nothing. And we're told poor people have to carry water, and these poor people who don't have schools, these poor people who walk barefoot. My friend from Vivo Barefoot is here, creating shoes so that we can be more like walking barefoot, because that's how we get the earth radiation. So these aren't these poor people. So we're getting such a misleading story that divides us. So I think what we will see when we look honestly is that civilization is the problem, which is why I'm also a little bit on the other side from some of my very dear colleagues in the global movement who keep talking about unecological civilization. I keep saying, I'm in favor of ecological cultures, smaller, more human scale, and more diverse. So there are certain principles that if we truly respect life, when we start looking at life, we will see its infinite diversity. Remember, every leaf as we sit here is changing. Every cell in our body is changing. So it's this constant change, this amazing diversity. And once we tune our eyes to it, and once we're more in touch with it, the richness is remarkable. And we can do that right now. Even with very sick ecosystems and sick people, there's still amazing wonder and life to be supported and affirmed. So I think, it's the big picture. The big picture is what can help us onto a truly global, united journey to take us back home. And using the word local, I keep hesitating in a way because it sounds very much like we're drawing into your local. But it's that the re-indigenization, which needs to happen global, we need a global movement. We need much deeper dialogue between so-called rich country and poor country. We need much deeper dialogue between all of these divisions, the unvaccinated and the vaccinated, people on different sides of the racial thing, between men and women, but all the time we're being pushed into a divided mind and more anger. And remember, right now it's algorithms that are fueling divisiveness in the social media. We know that. And yet some people are buying into the idea that AI is somehow going to be different. It's an extension of that. So we must try to have a voice for a pause mechanism. Let's slow down. Let's really see where algorithms have been helpful. Let's see if AI could be helpful. We've got to take it out of the war machine. We have to look at what people really need. Well, one more thing I want to say very loudly, which I haven't mentioned yet, and that is that we are caught in an economy right now which is making us too expensive for ourselves, too expensive to do what we need to do, to care for the soil, to care for our children, to care for the elderly. It takes time. It's human, ecological Gaia time. No, we can't afford it because we are imprisoned in an economy which is like we're being fed like stuffed geese. Electronic products from the other side of the world costing less than 2 organic potatoes from the local farm. We're in a completely fake economy where the prices reflect nothing but the handover of power to global corporations. It's what allows Amazon now to fly things around on a daily basis, whereas if you and I want to post one book within the country, it costs more than the price of the book itself. We are in a totally false economy. All the prices favor the billionaires that already have hundreds of billions. But more importantly, rather than looking at individuals, it favors the global corporate banking, and it's blind. Our government leaders do not understand what they're doing. They don't understand that they're impoverishing their own country, they're impoverishing their own government. Governments are now much poorer vis-a-vis a corporate empire than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. In the last 30 years, if you look at the curve of the corporate concentration and wealth, and you look at the poverty of governments, the poverty of the majority of people, and mental health issues, breakdown of environmental, every single indicator shows us this, but almost no one is looking at that bigger picture. So I hope you'll be interested in looking at it. It's very, very empowering when you do, because it shows that most of the problems we face come from that same system, and most of the solutions lie with changing that system. And please remember also that the people who are pushing to concentrate wealth further through trade treaties in these corporate hands, the number of people is less than 1%, much, much less than 1% of the global population. We have the power. We have the power. This would never happen if we woke up, if we were conscious. So when we talk about consciousness, let's not just talk about inner consciousness, let's talk about outer consciousness, and understand that both are connected. Consciousness is what we need of that outer system and its impact on our inner world. But I have to say too, in my 50 years of dealing with this, I often feel like, oh my God, I'm dealing with these two invisible realities. This invisible global economy, because no one dares to talk about it, and the invisible inner life, which only we can feel, in our hearts and stomachs. And those two invisible realities is what we need to. We are becoming conscious of our inner gut, and Zach and Richard are really helping us. And the whole movement is we are becoming more conscious of the inner world. But now the last piece is becoming conscious of the outer world also.
Hello, my name is Meher, and I'm a Pakistani woman, single mother, living in London, and just after 20 years of being in the corporate world, have recently been laid off. And I woke up to everything that you're saying while I was in my corporate job, and I had great difficulty deciding whether I want to leave it or stay and fight from within. And for a while, I did stay and fight from within, to the vertigo and all the forces and the things that I became awake to that you're talking about, but also being subject to being a single mother, living in a small family, no support, all of that stuff. And now I have to make the decision of whether to go back into the corporate world or to do something different. And I have two questions. One, do you think it's more effective to do it from within or without? I do have the expertise, of course, and the credibility to go in that space. And second, it's a slightly personal question for you, Helena. How do you re-energize and keep that passion? It is, once you wake up, it is so demoralizing. And it takes so much energy to transmute everything you see around you. So I'd love a response. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would say that the change will only come from outside. I think the last people to see the problems are those sitting in the hot seat of power. So I've had friends who were environmental activists who became parliamentarians, and then I've even had, one woman friend in Sweden who then became a minister. And when she was a minister, she started saying, well, Helen, I'm not so sure I agree with you. Before that, as an environmentalist and then even a member of parliament, she used to come to all my talks in Stockholm and agreed with me. When she was in power, she didn't. I had my godfather, who was a diplomat, And he was helping to bring Swedish business basically into the global economy through going into the EU, because the EU is an economic union. It's better than US, and so Brexit was not a good idea. But in Scandinavia, all the countries, we had strong movements trying to prevent joining the EU because it was an economic union led by big business that wanted standardization. They can't deal with diversity. They don't want different currencies, different languages, driving on left. So anyway, and he, as a diplomat, when he was at his peak, was saying, no, Helena, we can't have a referendum in Sweden that's going to be meaningful because people don't understand enough. I said, I know, but help us bring enough awareness so people will understand. But then when he retired, he writes to me and say, I'm beginning to agree with you about almost everything. Anyway, so what I would say is I would urge you to try to get some kind of work that doesn't have to absorb 100% of your mind and energy. Maybe you could work a few days part-time in the corporate world and earn enough so you could have a bit more freedom to then join the movement from the outside. And because right now it's very difficult to raise funds to actually deal with this corporate side of things. And remember, I'm not only trying to encourage that you deal with the corporate, but also that you actively support localization around local food economies. But there's so much work there about awareness raising, helping to share the websites, helping to get the word out. So things like that people could do on a volunteer basis or more, if possible. In terms of my life, I'm so glad that early on, it was so obvious to me that we needed to localize and that food and childcare was so central. So I do feel I'm so glad I've encouraged this movement towards the local and both around food and childcare. So almost every day I do get people writing to me or telling me, you changed my life. Thank you so much. And I feel nourished by the knowledge that in the long run, this is essential. And it's, for right now, incredibly healing. And so I just feel really happy about that. I also drive my husband a bit mad, who would prefer that I retire. I'm almost 80, and he would like me to slow down. But I'm really motivated by trying to raise awareness and seeing a slowing down of the global part. I'm not expecting it to suddenly reverse or anything, but just slowing down, more of a voice out there, more of my friends not being afraid to address it, more of my friends not feeling that, many of them I think feel it can't be done, it's too big, let's not even think about that, let's just do the small and the local. But I think that stronger voice against the big global, which remember is only much less than 1%. 1% of the global population is 80 million people. We estimate that the people that are really actively pushing this global, we're all unwittingly supporting it by just going along with it. And a lot of our going along is sending our children to conventional schools and universities because we believe they're going to have a better life. That's how we support it, because the conventional education is worse and worse, taking them down that path. So consciously pushing would be maybe 1 million, something like that. It's like nothing. We have the power. It's just the numbers. It's just waking up, becoming conscious of the outer. And the outer is way off there in the global. And you have to search for the information because it's been blocked. We've been shadow banned years ago from Facebook and so on. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you both. I had a question, Helena, you spoke about deeper dialogue, that we need more deeper dialogue with polarizing topics, polarized groups. And so my concrete question will be about your perspective on rewilding. And just to give it a bit of context, I totally subscribe to the movement and vision that you are sharing today. And I noticed that that's already 2 years ago that I got to know it, and I noticed that many friends they were like very resistant. So I organized deeper dialogues around the food system. How can we improve this food system? And I put the most polarizing views, which was this view, which is like organic smallholder farms. And the other view that also seeks to better the food system, we seemed it's more technocratic, but it's basically people saying rewilding. So we should not have, in short, their claim is, which you're probably familiar with, is we should have intensive farming, maybe a few city small farms so you get to know like how food is made. And then we should just mainly rewild lots of the land, because they argue that biodynamic farms are still way less biodiverse than rewilded forests. And so if we need more biodiversity to fight climate change and biodiversity loss. And therefore they are very annoyed, the people I was listening to, about the movement of biodynamic farming, because they say they are denying these statistics. And for me, it was also really these two views seem to be very like a masculine and feminine, because the biodynamic seems very like relational and we need to change the social structure, whilst the rewilding is more like, look at the numbers and also respect that. So I'm just, it's a bit of a long context, but I'm really curious to hear your view on that.
Thank you very much for laying that out, and it's a very, very important discussion. And mainly what's happening is that corporate think tanks, and I really don't believe that people doing this are evil, but it's pretty evil in a way what they're doing. And they are actively working to destroy the localizing bottom-up side of things. You're absolutely right. It's extremely masculine. It's looking at numbers. We heard, anyway, first of all, please remember, we are too many people to continue urbanizing. In the urban centers, the average person uses far more water and resources per capita. What's happening is that the mainstream thing that talks about the numbers of so many people ignores the fact that these cities, we're crowded together, but London, analysis shows essentially uses more land than all of England. So there's a link between the global economy and these urban centers. We actually need more people on the land. If we want to properly restore every last bit of our ecosystem, we need more people, whether we're just rewilding or growing food. We actually need more people. The rewilding that's being pushed in the corporate, really horrible propaganda will involve numbers that say, we planted 2,000 trees over there. They're talking about bunging up monocultures where the trees are in unsuitable locations, where it is absolutely a game of numbers and ethical investment. It is profoundly unethical. But again, the people who do it are not necessarily bad people. So the truth is, the wonderful truth is that, yes, we are probably a bit overcrowded on this planet. The planet might well be better off with fewer people. But the amazing truth is that what built up the population, led to population explosions, was a fossil fuel-based, energy-intensive, urbanizing, globalizing path, which not only led to population increases, but also led to the increase in consumption for every person. So remember, every day children are being targeted, also in India, in Mumbai, but in the villages all around the world, to consume more unnecessary things, very, very energy intensive, very resource intensive. So we have a system that constantly is trying to drive up consumerism. The same system now is making it impossible to repair things. So the high-tech stuff you can't repair. The same system is now using more and more built-in obsolescence so that things are programmed to break down. I recommend a film about this called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, because even going back with light bulbs, there were cartels that told factories, you're not allowed to make a light bulb that can last a lifetime. Edison's light bulb is still burning, but they were told, no, you're not allowed to do that. You can only live X number of hours. And of course, those hours have shortened. So again, when you realize it's only less than 1% who are still pursuing this madness, there is true hope if we wake up to looking at it. Rewilding is being used by this dominant patriarchal corporate system to present this idea of essentially 100% urbanization. They're not saying that, but that's what it is. We're all slated, because they're destroying farmers worldwide with these crazy, crazy regulations and the taxes, destroying farming, herding us into cities, and then a bit of rewilding, fine, but really the system is driving towards synthetic food, right now high-rise agriculture, plastic meat. Demonizing animals in agriculture is very sad. There are still hundreds of millions of small farmers in the non-Western world especially that might have a goat or a cow, and they eat waste. They do not compete with human population. They provide milk, they provide protein. Remember, most, if not all, indigenous people ate animal products. And in my, beloved culture that I spent, 40 years living with and speaking the language fluently, what I saw was that traditionally the animals were killed with this great respect and ritual. All their worldview was about the interconnectedness and the respect for everything that lived. But they did take the life of animals and they did eat them. And they were extremely healthy. In comes the modern system, destroying farming. Now they have almost no animals of their own, but now they're eating more meat from horrible factories. Factory farmed anything we should never eat, especially animals. It just couldn't be more cruel. It couldn't be more horrible for the animals, for us, for the earth. But it's a really important issue to think about, because the corporate system wants to transport everything so that we don't have self-reliance, and they really are very actively demonizing any animals in the farming cycle. So we actually need more people to heal the damage done by fossil fuel machines, fossil fuel-based toxic chemicals. Right now, the system uses machines, so all the apples are picked, whether ripe or not, and then half are often burnt, We need people who are picking those that are ripe and not those. And in the small, diversified systems, we can produce far, far more per unit of land, and we can leave far more land truly wild. And I like to call the diversified local agri-wilding, because it actually creates space for wildlife and brings back wildlife. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much for a beautiful conversation. I also just came back from Tibet, so it's really beautiful to hear your source of inspiration. And I was also in Bhutan last year, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on their, let's say, top-down action, where the king himself is a spiritual practitioner and has contributed to that in their own constitution. They want to leave, I think it's around 70% of nature intact. So it's from top down, an action that's inspired by world view. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because to me it seems like where is the first step of action is so deeply interconnected with the view, with the world view. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, I did work in Bhutan in the 80s, between 84 and 89, and I think it came originally from the older king, who actually told the World Bank when they came that we're more interested in gross national happiness than we are in gross national product. Unfortunately, now the current king and the current prime minister are not as interested in this as the previous king and prime minister were, going back about 15 years ago. And so I was involved with a project there about 15 years ago to starting this program of gross national happiness. So I think absolutely wonderful if there were a government that would really be committed to it. But my frustration working in Bhutan was that I wasn't able to facilitate the sort of international dialogue that our work did in Ladakh. We actually sponsored community leaders to come to the West, both to see with their own eyes that things are not this paradise that is presented to them. So there's this propaganda everywhere saying that this urban consumer culture is so sexy and wonderful. And in non-Western cultures, it has a huge impact, making people feel stupid and backward. So we brought people to see with their own eyes, also from Bhutan, actually. And then not only to see that we have problems here, but also to see these new initiatives where people were trying to build community, eco-villages, healthy farming, organic farming. And that's a very strategic way. That's what we need, is deeper dialogue. We need actually for people who care to travel more. I'm really worried that it's been a change now where people who care think they shouldn't travel, and they don't realize that their tax dollars and consumer dollars are traveling more than ever. The corporate purveyors of mass tourism, mass consumerism are traveling more than ever. So this is why it's so wonderful that it's international here, and we need more. And I know Krisha is trying to bring people from this sort of movement also to India. And Krisha has also been working in Bhutan with the current king and prime minister. Maybe you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I think to say working with is a bit soon, but I recently visited Bhutan and was so incredibly inspired and motivated. When I heard about GNH first as a concept, gross national happiness, I felt like it was the big missing link that I had been looking for. An anchor that can orient an entire nation or an entire group of people towards something higher or more meaningful than just GDP or money. And I come from a place of deep understanding. Even when I visit Bhutan, I have so much admiration and respect for the vision that's being set out. And I also have a lot of compassion for the difficulty for anybody in this day and age with the pressures, the financial pressures, especially debt pressures from institutions like the World Bank and things, to figure out how to extricate themselves from the challenges that we all face, countries big like India or small like Bhutan. I feel very, very motivated to contribute in any way possible to further the aspirations of that nation, but also any projects that are similar. I did a visit with Ruby, in fact, from Advaya and a bunch of other people to a place called Auroville in India. I'm sure some people here may know of it. And it was designed decades ago as a spiritual community, a city for people of all religions from all over the world to come together and aspire towards a higher consciousness. But Auroville is facing massive challenges today. We went to kind of observe and understand the nuances and the challenges. And it allowed me to have the perspective which I think holds true for everywhere. It's not any one entity or one leadership that is bad or wrong. I think when you see the challenges that are holding each stakeholder back or what's limiting us, we can start to understand the design of the system that's not letting us move in a different direction. So I'm very excited about Bhutan, and I have a lot of respect for the vision that they're taking forward. And I hope that we can contribute if we have this kind of awareness and these kinds of conversations. I think there's so much for us to go and learn from people who are trying to actually do that on ground, and also give back anything that we may have learned from the outside. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you to Helena and to Krisha.